The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness. A black man in a sharp suit steps out of his luxury sedan, his hands raised slightly. "Get on the ground, now!" Officer Rebecca Sloan barks, her hand gripping her gun. The man doesn't. "Officer, there's no need for this. I'm Judge Malcolm Reeves." Rebecca smirks. "Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England." Suddenly, another car screeches to a stop. A commanding voice booms, "Release him at once!" Rebecca freezes. The man stepping out is Chief Justice David Holloway, Malcolm's boss. What happens next will change everything. Before we begin, where are you watching from? And if you believe in justice, hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Judge Malcolm Reeves walked out of the grand ballroom, the lingering hum of polite applause still echoing in his mind. The charity gala had been a success, and his speech on equal justice had been met with admiration from some and subtle skepticism from others. He adjusted his cufflinks, took a deep breath of the crisp night air, and made his way toward the valet station, where his car, a sleek black luxury sedan, waited under the soft glow of a street lamp. The young white valet glanced at him, hesitating, for a fraction of a second before shifting uncomfortably. Sir, are you sure this is your car?" Malcolm paused, the question hitting him harder than it should have. He was used to this, people second-guessing his success, assuming he didn't belong, questioning what he had rightfully earned. He forced a polite smile, reaching into his pocket and handing over his valet ticket. "Yes, I'm sure." The valet took the ticket but still seemed skeptical. Instead of retrieving the car immediately, he looked over at his colleague, exchanged a glance, and only then walked off to bring the vehicle around. Malcolm exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar burn of frustration settle in his chest. It wasn't outright hostility, but it was 1,000 small cuts that bled over time. As he slid into the driver's seat and adjusted his mirrors, he couldn't shake the weight of the moment. His entire career had been built on defying expectations, proving that he was more than what people assumed at first glance. But even now, even as a federal judge, he couldn't escape the quiet, insidious reminders that in some eyes, his success was always in question. He pulled out of the valet area and merged onto the road, heading toward the highway. The streets were quiet, illuminated by flickering streetlights and the occasional passing car. It wasn't until he turned onto the main road that he noticed a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought nothing of it. Routine patrol, maybe just coincidence. But then, as he switched lanes, so did the cruiser. When he slowed for a stoplight, the police car stayed uncomfortably close, the glow of its headlights casting long shadows inside his vehicle. Malcolm kept his hands at 10 and 2, every muscle in his body tightening. He'd been here before. Not this exact situation, but something close enough. Being followed, watched, treated with silent suspicion. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. He was still 15 minutes from home. Maybe the car would turn off at the next intersection. He signaled early, made a smooth right turn. The police car followed. A slow exhale, his grip tightened on the wheel. "Stay calm, don't speed, don't make any sudden movements." The logic was ingrained in him, a survival mechanism passed down through generations. He adjusted his mirror slightly and caught a glimpse of the officer behind the wheel, a blonde woman with sharp, focused eyes, her jaw tight with something that looked like restrained hostility. His stomach turned, but he pushed the thought away. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just on a routine patrol. Maybe, but deep down, he knew better. The red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind him, the piercing wail of a siren cutting through the silence. Damn it. Malcolm's pulse quickened, but his face remained composed as he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. He kept, his hands visible, resting them on the steering wheel, his breathing measured. He had done nothing wrong. He knew that. And yet the reality of the situation remained. This could go very, very wrong. The police cruiser came to a slow stop behind him, the bright floodlights bathing his car in an eerie white glow. He could see the silhouette of the officer stepping out, the heavy sound of boots against pavement growing closer. Then, a harsh knock against the window. He turned his head, pressing the button to roll it down. The officer, a blonde woman with cold, calculating eyes, stood tall, her expression unreadable. "License and registration," she said curtly, her voice laced with thinly veiled hostility. Malcolm nodded, moving slowly to retrieve his wallet from his jacket. "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" He kept his voice steady, polite, but firm. The cop, Rebecca Sloan, didn't answer immediately. Instead, she flicked her gaze over his car, her lips twisting into something that almost resembled a sneer. "You were driving a little aggressively back there," she said. Malcolm frowned. He had been driving perfectly within the speed limit, signaling every turn, obeying every rule. He knew this was an excuse, a flimsy, baseless excuse. Still, he remained composed. He handed her his license and registration, watching as her eyes scanned the information. And then he saw it. The moment of hesitation, the flicker of disbelief that quickly morphed into something more dangerous. She looked back at him, raising an eyebrow. "Judge, huh?" she muttered, as if the very idea of a black man in such a position was impossible. Malcolm held her gaze. "That's correct." There was a beat of silence, a thinly stretched pause where the air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. Then, she let out a mocking laugh, shaking her head. "A black judge? Yeah, and I bet you play in the NBA too." The words landed, like a slap, but Malcolm didn't react. He had heard it all before, the assumption that black men could only be athletes, entertainers, never judges, never men of law. Instead of rising to the bait, he simply said, "I'd like to know the real reason I was pulled over." Sloan's smirk faded slightly, replaced with something colder, more calculating. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered. Malcolm didn't move. "On what grounds?" She took a step closer, her hand resting on her holster. "I said step out." Malcolm clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He could comply and risk escalation, or refuse and risk being labeled as non-compliant. Either way, the outcome was already stacked against him. Slowly, he reached for the door handle, stepping out into the cold night air. "Turn around, hands on the car." The command came sharp, leaving no room for negotiation. A small part of him wanted to resist, to demand an explanation, to remind her who he was. But he knew how these situations could spiral. He had seen the headlines, he had seen the funerals. So he did as he was told, placing his hands firmly against the roof of his vehicle. He felt her hands grip his shoulders roughly, shoving him forward with unnecessary force. "You're making a mistake," he said evenly. "You don't want to do this." But Sloan just tightened her grip, pressing him harder against the car. "I'll be the judge of that." And in that moment, Malcolm knew. This wasn't about law or justice. This was about power. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of how you look? Comment number 1 if you think Malcolm is handling this the right way. Like if you believe this situation is completely unfair. And subscribe if you want to see how justice plays out in the end. But what happens when Sloan realizes exactly who she just detained? Stay tuned. Malcolm felt the cold metal of the patrol car pressing against his chest as Officer Rebecca Sloan's grip on his wrist tightened. Her fingers dug into his skin, an unnecessary show of force that made it clear. This wasn't just protocol. This was personal. He gritted his teeth, keeping his breathing even, refusing to let her see any sign of discomfort. He had been in enough courtrooms to recognize power plays when he saw them. But this was different. This wasn't a courtroom where he could counter with logic and law. This was the street, and here, Sloan held all the power. His heart pounded as he heard her radio crackle to life. "I have a possible stolen vehicle suspect in custody," she said, her voice calm, composed, utterly indifferent. Malcolm's jaw clenched. "A stolen vehicle suspect?" "That's a lie," he said evenly, his voice controlled but firm. "This is my car, and you know it." Sloan scoffed. "Yeah? Well, let's just see what the system says, huh?" Malcolm could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The countless black men before him who had been in this exact situation. Wrongfully accused, humiliated, treated as criminals simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this wasn't just about humiliation. This was about control. Another police cruiser pulled up behind them, its headlights adding to the harsh, blinding light already illuminating the scene. Officer Greg Miller, a younger cop with a hesitant look in his eyes, stepped out of the car. Malcolm saw the moment of uncertainty flash across Miller's face as he glanced at him, then at Sloan, then back again. Miller recognized him. Malcolm could see it in his eyes. A flicker of hesitation, the slight shift in posture, the way his gaze darted between them, but he said nothing. He didn't challenge Sloan, he didn't intervene. He simply stood by, watching, silent, passive, complacent. Malcolm exhaled slowly. He had seen this before. The quiet officers, the ones who didn't hurl slurs or use excessive force, but who also didn't stop it from happening. The ones who let injustice unfold simply because speaking up would be inconvenient, uncomfortable, dangerous. Sloan smirked, pulling his arms back roughly and snapping the cold metal of handcuffs around his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," she said, her voice laced with something that almost sounded like amusement. A cruel joke. Malcolm could feel the anger boiling inside him, but he swallowed it down. Reacting would only make things worse. He had spent years mastering the art of control, of not giving people like Sloan an excuse to escalate. But every fiber of his being rejected the injustice of this moment. He was a federal judge, yet here he was, being treated like a common criminal simply because she decided he didn't belong in his own car. Sloan shoved him toward the back of the police car, the cuffs biting into his wrists as she forced him into the seat. "Don't worry, Judge," she said mockingly. "I'll make sure to handle your case personally." Malcolm stared at her, his expression unreadable, but inside, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Miller finally spoke, his voice uncertain. "Louis Sloan, maybe we should—" Sloan cut him off with a sharp glare. "Run his plates." Miller hesitated. Then, with obvious reluctance, he walked back to the squad car and typed in the information. A tense silence followed. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the static-filled buzz of the police radio. Then Malcolm saw it. The moment Miller's expression shifted, his eyes widened slightly, his shoulders tensed, his fingers froze over the keyboard. Sloan, oblivious, stood with her arms crossed, watching Malcolm with thinly veiled contempt. "What's the holdup, Miller?" she asked impatiently. Miller swallowed hard, shifting awkwardly. He didn't want to say it. "Sloan," he started, his voice low, careful, warning her. "What?" she snapped. Miller exhaled, running a hand over his face. "He's telling the truth." Sloan's expression hardened. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Miller said, his voice unsteady, "his car isn't stolen. It's registered to him." Silence. Malcolm watched the way Sloan's jaw tightened. Her nostrils flared. She didn't look relieved that she hadn't just unlawfully arrested an innocent man. She looked angry, like she had lost a game she thought was already won. Instead of admitting her mistake, she turned back to Malcolm, her eyes narrowing. "Then why were you acting so suspicious?" Malcolm let out a short, humorless laugh. Suspicious. That word, that label, that excuse. "You mean, why didn't I immediately comply when you started treating me like a criminal?" Sloan's expression darkened. She looked at Miller, as if silently daring him to challenge her authority. Miller shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Malcolm had seen enough. He turned his gaze to Miller, his voice calm but pointed. "You know this isn't right." Miller looked away. For a second, just a second, Malcolm wondered if Miller would be the one to step up. If he would be the officer, who finally said, "Enough." But instead, Miller let out a slow exhale, shook his head, and muttered, "We should let him go." Should, not must. Not this was wrong, just should. Sloan clenched her jaw, staring at Malcolm like she was debating whether to double down or back off. Then, with a sharp huff, she reached for the cuffs, unlocking them with more force than necessary. The metal clicked open, and Malcolm rubbed his wrists, resisting the urge to say anything that would give her an excuse to retaliate. Sloan stepped back, her expression unreadable, but her anger still palpable. "Next time," she said, her voice low, cold, "don't act like you own the place." Malcolm's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile, not out of amusement, but out of certainty. He had spent years watching people like Sloan from behind. The bench, understanding the way they operated, the way their power relied on fear, on control, on unchecked authority. And right now, standing in front of her, free and unbroken, he knew something she didn't. This wasn't over. Sloan turned on her heel and stalked back to her car, but her hands were balled into fists. She had lost control of the situation, and it enraged her. But Malcolm had already decided he wasn't letting this slide. This wasn't just about him. This was about every person before him who hadn't been believed. Every person who had ended up in a cell, or worse, in a grave, because someone like Sloan decided they didn't belong. As he straightened his suit and adjusted his cuffs, he made a silent promise. She would answer for this. Malcolm stood by his car, his wrists still sore from the tight cuffs, as Officer Sloan stomped back to her patrol car, radiating barely restrained anger. The humiliation should have ended there. He should have been able to get back into his car, drive away and put this behind him. But injustice had a way of clinging to you, of stretching its claws into every moment, refusing to let go. And tonight was no different. Just as he reached for his car door, a sharp voice cut through the tense silence. "Hey, I got it all on video." The voice was young, urgent, filled with barely contained outrage. Malcolm turned, his eyes landing on a young black man standing on the sidewalk, phone raised, camera still recording. His hands trembled slightly, but his grip remained firm. "This is racial profiling, and we all know it," he continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. "This is Judge Reeves. You just put a judge in cuffs for nothing. What do you have to say for yourself?" Malcolm saw the exact moment Sloan's face drained of color. It wasn't fear. It was fury. Fury at being caught, at being exposed. She turned sharply, marching toward the young man. "Turn that off," she snapped, her voice low, threatening. But the man stood his ground. Or what? His voice shook slightly, but he didn't lower his phone. "You gonna arrest me too? For filming? For telling the truth?" Sloan stopped just inches from him, her jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Malcolm could see the war raging behind her eyes. She wanted to retaliate. She wanted to take control back. But she knew she couldn't. Not now. Not with the world watching. Malcolm stepped forward, his voice smooth but firm. "Officer Sloan," he said, watching as she reluctantly turned back toward him, her hands fisting at her sides. "You've already made one mistake tonight. Don't make another." Her glare could have cut through steel, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned abruptly, storming back toward her car. She yanked the door open, threw herself inside, and slammed it shut with enough force to shake the vehicle. A beat of silence passed. Then the engine roared to life, and with a sharp jerk of the wheel, she sped off, tires screeching against the pavement. Malcolm finally turned back to the young man, nodding. "Thank you," he said sincerely. The man nodded back, swallowing. He hesitated, then continued. "I've seen too much of this, too many times where there's no proof and they get away with it. Not this time." Malcolm's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and deep sadness settling over him. He knew exactly what the young man meant. He had spent his entire career fighting against the system that allowed this kind of abuse to go unchecked. But this time he wasn't just fighting in a courtroom, he was living it. More people had started to gather now, whispers spreading through the small crowd. Some were pulling out their phones, replaying the video, watching Sloan's face shift from arrogance to panic. The weight of it all pressed against Malcolm's shoulders. But he stood tall, knowing this wasn't the end. This wasn't over. Not yet, because now there was proof, and with proof came power. What would you have done in Malcolm's situation? Comment number 1 if you think he handled it the right way. Like if you believe Sloan needs to face consequences for her actions, and subscribe if you want to see how Malcolm fights back. But what happens when this video reaches the people who hold real power? Stay tuned. The next morning, Malcolm Reeves walked through the grand marble entrance of the courthouse, his polished shoes clicking against the floor in steady, deliberate strides. His face was calm, composed, but inside his mind was razor-sharp. Already, anticipating the battle ahead, he had barely slept. The events of the night before replayed in his head like a film stuck on an endless loop, the cold steel of the cuffs biting into his wrists, Officer Sloan's smug, condescending tone, the weight of centuries of injustice pressing against his ribs. But today, he wasn't the one on trial. She was. The viral video had spread like wildfire overnight. By morning, news outlets had picked it up. Headlines splashed across screens with phrases like "federal judge racially profiled by officer" and "video exposes shocking police misconduct." Social media had erupted in outrage, and the pressure on the department had become impossible to ignore. The police chief had no choice but to act. Now, Sloan had been called in for an internal review hearing, and Malcolm was here to make sure she faced the consequences of her actions. He passed through the security checkpoint, his presence commanding silent respect from the staff who recognized him. As he approached the conference room, he saw a familiar face, Chief Justice David Holloway, the most powerful judge in the state. Holloway had been his mentor, the man who had guided him through the treacherous waters of the legal system, and more importantly, a man who despised injustice in all forms. He gave Malcolm a single nod, his eyes filled with unspoken understanding. "I saw the video," Holloway said, his deep voice laced with restrained anger. "This is unacceptable." Malcolm simply nodded. He didn't need to say anything. They both knew what needed to be done. Inside the conference room, the tension was palpable. Sloan sat at the long wooden table, her uniform crisp, but her posture stiff. She looked nothing like the arrogant officer from the night before. Instead, she looked cornered. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers curling tightly around the pen in front of her. Across from her sat the police commissioner, a heavy-set man with salt and pepper hair and an expression that gave away nothing. To his right, two internal affairs officers sat, ready to evaluate the case. And then Malcolm stepped inside. For the first time, Sloan's mask cracked. Her eyes widened just slightly before she caught herself, schooling her expression back into something resembling composure. But Malcolm saw the flicker of panic. She hadn't expected him to be here. She had thought that after last night, after she had let him go, the worst was over. She was wrong. The police commissioner cleared his throat. "Let's get started." The room fell silent as one of the internal affairs officers pulled out a folder, flipping through a stack of papers. "Officer Sloan, you've been brought in for an internal review following a complaint regarding your conduct during a traffic stop last night. A video of the incident has surfaced and we will be reviewing it today." Sloan didn't move. She sat rigid, her jaw locked tight, but Malcolm could see the way her fingers twitched against the table. She wasn't just nervous, she was furious. The officer turned on the monitor, and the room fell into silence as the video played. The grainy footage from the bystander's phone filled the screen. Sloan yanking Malcolm out of his car, the mocking tone in her voice, the way she tightened the cuffs around his wrists, the sheer disdain dripping from her every word. And then, the moment that had sealed her fate, the way she had dismissed him, had smirked as she said, "Next time, don't act like you own the place." The silence that followed was deafening. Malcolm didn't need to look at Holloway to know that he was seething. The police commissioner's expression had darkened, his fingers interlacing on the table in front of him. Sloan, however, sat stone-faced. Her pride wouldn't allow her to show any sign of remorse. Instead, she doubled down. "He was being uncooperative," she said, her voice clipped, controlled. "I had reason to believe he was a threat." Malcolm let out a slow, controlled breath. There it was. The old excuse, the same tired justification used time and time again. The angry black man stereotype. The idea that any sign of resistance, even something as simple as questioning an officer's authority, was grounds for aggression. Holloway's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "A threat? A federal judge was a threat to you?" His words hung heavy in the air, the weight of them pressing down on Sloan like an anvil. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Because there was no answer she could give that wouldn't expose the truth. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice measured, controlled. "Officer Sloan," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "do you treat all traffic stops with this level of hostility? Or just the ones where the driver looks like me?" Sloan's face twitched. The question was a loaded one, impossible to answer without condemning herself. She shifted in her seat, her hands balling into fists. The commissioner exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Officer Sloan, based on the evidence presented and the public outcry this has caused, I have no choice but to place you on immediate suspension pending further investigation." Sloan's eyes snapped to him, disbelief flashing across her face. "You can't be serious," she hissed. "That video doesn't show the full context. He was—" "Enough," the commissioner interrupted, his patience clearly worn thin. "Your conduct is indefensible. The department will be making a formal statement regarding this incident, and you are to surrender your badge and firearm until further notice." Sloan shot up from her chair. "This is ridiculous. You're throwing me under the bus for doing my job?" But no one responded. The decision had already been made. Malcolm watched as she gritted her teeth, her body stiff with rage. This wasn't just about losing her badge. This was about losing control, and people like Sloan, they didn't handle that well. She turned to Malcolm, and for the briefest moment, the mask slipped completely. "This isn't over," she muttered, her voice venomous. Malcolm met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "No," he said calmly. "It's just the beginning." Sloan's hands curled into fists, but she said nothing else. She turned sharply and stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Malcolm sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It was a victory, but it wasn't justice, not yet. Because a suspension wasn't enough. Not for what she had done. Not for what she had almost gotten away with. Holloway turned to Malcolm, his voice quiet but firm. "You know this isn't where it ends." Malcolm nodded. He knew. Because Sloan wasn't the real problem. She was just a symptom of something, much bigger. Something that wouldn't be fixed with a single disciplinary hearing. But this was a start. And Malcolm wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Malcolm adjusted his robe as he took his seat at the towering mahogany bench of the courtroom, his gavel resting within reach. The weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders, but his expression remained unreadable, his features carefully composed. He had presided over countless cases, had heard thousands of arguments, had passed judgment on people who had stood exactly where she was standing now. But this time was different. This time it was Officer Rebecca Sloan sitting at the defense table, stripped of her uniform, stripped of her badge, stripped of the power she once wielded so recklessly. She was no longer the enforcer of the law. She was now at its mercy. The irony was suffocating. Sloan, once so smug, so sure of herself, sat stiff-backed in civilian clothes, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. But she wasn't afraid. Not yet. No, she still believed that this system, the one that had protected her for years, would do so again. Malcolm could see it in her rigid posture, in the tight set of her jaw, in the way her eyes flicked around the room like she was searching for an ally. But there were none. Not anymore. The prosecution began, their voices steady, their evidence irrefutable. The video of the wrongful detainment, the public outrage, the department's official statements, the internal investigation that had uncovered a pattern of complaints against Sloan, excessive force, racial bias, misconduct, complaints that had been buried, ignored, dismissed. Until now, Sloan remained silent as her attorney argued on her behalf, the usual defenses tumbling from his lips. She was just doing her job. There was a misunderstanding. There was no racial bias. But the words felt hollow, empty, desperate. Malcolm listened carefully, giving no indication of his thoughts. This wasn't about personal vengeance. It wasn't about anger or retribution. This was about something far bigger than him, bigger than her. This was about accountability. And then the moment came. Malcolm's eyes locked onto Sloan's, his voice steady even. "Officer Sloan," he began, his tone calm but unwavering, "you stand accused of misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of power. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You had ample opportunity to rectify your actions, yet you refused. You have been entrusted with the power of the law, and you have used it to oppress rather than protect. That is not just a violation of protocol, it is a violation of justice itself." Sloan's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "What could she say?" The courtroom was silent, all eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Malcolm inhaled slowly, choosing his next words with deliberate care. "This court finds you guilty of gross misconduct," he continued, each syllable a final nail in the coffin of her career. "You are hereby stripped of all legal authority. You will never wear a badge again. You are sentenced to court-mandated racial bias training, and your record will reflect your actions for any future employer to see." A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't jail time. It wasn't a criminal conviction. But it was something worse for people like Sloan. It was permanent disgrace. It was a mark on her record that would follow her for the rest of her life. She would never hold power again. Never flash a badge and expect instant obedience. Never use the law as a weapon against those she deemed unworthy. It was over. Truly, completely over. Sloan's face remained blank, but Malcolm saw the truth in her eyes, the rage, the hatred, the realization that this time she had lost. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, she turned her head just slightly, just enough for Malcolm to catch the venomous words that left her lips. "This isn't over." But Malcolm only smiled. Not in amusement, not in triumph, but in certainty. "No," he said softly, only for her to hear. "It's just the beginning." And with that, the door closed behind her, the echoes of her footsteps fading into nothing. Malcolm stepped out of the courthouse, the sun casting long shadows across the steps as he inhaled the crisp afternoon air. The weight of the trial, of everything that had transpired in the past days, still clung to him. But there was something else now, a quiet, steady resolve. He had seen justice served today, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been stopped, questioned, doubted, and degraded simply because of the color of their skin. The system had worked this time, but Malcolm knew one victory did not erase centuries of injustice. This was just one battle in a war that was far from over. As he descended the steps, voices murmured around him, journalists and bystanders whispering about the case, the verdict, the fall of a once untouchable officer. Some had their phones out, recording, documenting the moment, turning it into yet another headline in the ongoing fight against systemic racism. He ignored them, his focus shifting to the young black man waiting at the bottom of the steps, the same man who had filmed Sloan's abuse of power that night. The man's hands were shoved into his pockets, his shoulders tense, his face uncertain. Malcolm could see the hesitation in his eyes, as if he wasn't sure if he should say something or if this moment even belonged to him. Malcolm offered a small nod, a silent acknowledgement, an unspoken thank you. Without him, there would have been no video, no public outcry, no undeniable proof of what had happened that night. The young man swallowed, then finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. I wanted to say, what you did in there." He stopped himself, exhaling sharply, then shook his head. "People like me. We don't see people like you very often." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "People like me?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't look away. "People who actually have power," clarified. "People who look like us but get to sit behind that bench. People who don't just tell us to be quiet and take it." Malcolm studied him for a long moment, hearing the unspoken frustration, the exhaustion, the years of learned hopelessness. He had seen that look before. in the eyes of too many young black men who had grown up believing that justice was something that happened to other people, something that was never meant for them. It wasn't a compliment. It was a challenge. Do something with your power. Don't let this be just another case. Malcolm exhaled slowly, the weight of his robe suddenly feeling heavier. He understood. He had spent his entire career walking a tightrope, careful not to show too much emotion, careful not to give anyone a reason to doubt his professionalism, his neutrality. But the truth was, neutrality had never protected people like him, and neutrality would not change the system. He had done his job today, but there was still so much more to do. He extended his hand, firm and unwavering. "Then let's make sure people like me aren't so rare," he said simply. The young man blinked, momentarily caught off guard, before reaching forward and shaking Malcolm's hand. As Malcolm turned away, heading toward his car, he felt the weight of the day settle onto his shoulders. But this time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a responsibility. He knew there would be more Sloans out there, more officers who abused their power, more people who thought they were untouchable. He also knew there would be more young men with phones, more witnesses, willing to speak up, more voices refusing to be silenced. The tide was changing, slowly, painfully, but it was changing, and Malcolm Reeves would make sure that this was just the beginning. As he drove away, the courthouse shrinking in his rearview mirror, he knew one thing for certain. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about setting things right. And as long as he had a seat behind that bench, he would never let injustice go unanswered again. This story is more than just an isolated incident. It reflects a much deeper, systemic issue that has existed for generations. Malcolm Reeves may have won this battle, but the truth is, many people never get the chance to fight back. How many individuals have been unlawfully detained, harassed, or even killed without a camera to capture the truth? How many times has justice been denied simply because the system is designed to protect those in power rather than those it claims to serve? Accountability should not depend on a viral video. It should be a fundamental part of law enforcement and the justice system. Officer Sloan's downfall wasn't just about her actions that night. It was about a pattern of unchecked abuse, a system that allowed her to operate without consequences until she targeted the wrong person. The truth is, if Malcolm hadn't been a federal judge, this case might have ended very differently. That fact alone should concern us all. But this story also highlights an important truth. Change is possible. A bystander with a phone made a difference. Public outcry forced action. The justice system, for once, held an officer accountable. This is the power of speaking up, of demanding better, of refusing to stay silent. It's a reminder that the fight against injustice isn't just fought in courtrooms. It's fought in our everyday decisions, in our willingness to challenge corruption, and in our refusal to accept oppression as the status quo. What do you think? Was Sloan's punishment fair, or should more have been done? Comment number 1 if you believe justice was served, like if you think we need more accountability in law enforcement. And subscribe if you want to see more stories like this. Share this video if you believe these conversations need to continue. Thank you for watching, and remember, justice isn't just about punishment, it's about change. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next story.